Welcome back to the Bechdel Test Podcast.
Unreal to me.
No, welcome back to the Stage 18 Podcast. We are happy to have you. You know, usually we would start out talking about the state of the box office today, but bit of a problem. Theaters have been closed for a few months now, and there aren't really any new releases to go over.
But there might be. There's Tenet. Well, Tenet did actually get delayed again at the time of recording this podcast. The release date is August 12th, but I'll honestly be shocked if it doesn't get delayed again.
And I think that's more than likely at this point. We know Nolan would die before he releases a movie on video on demand. So we're going to have to keep playing this game of nudging it back a month at a time until things completely reopen, is my guess.
Yeah, and if you haven't heard of Tenet, Tenet is Christopher Nolan's upcoming movie. You know Christopher Nolan. He's basically the Elon Musk of modern cinema. And there was just a second trailer came out for the Tenet movie. My first thought on watching this trailer was, yep, that's definitely a Christopher Nolan movie. You know, you got the big, heavy bass horn, boom, just for no reason. And then we have something about I don't know what it is about Nolan movies, but something about like the filter on the camera or like the posture of the characters. You know, obviously there's a new concept that's going to need a lot of explaining. And so it definitely looks like a Christopher Nolan movie. And honestly, after watching this trailer, I haven't ruled out that it's not Christopher Nolan just parroting his own movies.
It does seem like he is sticking to the same formula that he always uses. It's hard to tell even what's going to happen in this movie. You know, the trailer doesn't give away much, which is common for Christopher Nolan movies. But I'm just excited to see these two actors in this type of movie. I don't think they've been really given a chance to shine yet.
As usual, Christopher Nolan has some big stars in his cast. I would say these are two rising stars in Tenet. First, there's John David Washington. We know him from BlacKkKlansman, Denzel Washington's son. And then we also have Stage 18 podcast favorite Robert Pattinson. I would honestly say that Washington and Pattinson right now are the best two male millennial actors working at the moment.
I mean, with Washington, I think it's hard to say. We haven't seen much of him yet. He was great in BlacKkKlansman, as you mentioned. But I think, you know, Michael B. Jordan and Adam Driver have to be in that conversation, too.
Michael B. Jordan is fine. He doesn't really jump off the screen to me, though. Adam Driver could have a pretty long career. You know, hopefully Star Wars doesn't forever taint him. But he was really good in Marriage Story and good in a lot of things. And, of course, longtime listeners of the Stage 18 podcast will know we basically spoke Robert Pattinson's recent rise in Hollywood. We spoke that into existence. We all know he already landed the Batman gig. But I'd say this is the first time since Twilight Pattinson has been in a real blockbuster movie coming out. You know, it has all the prestige and status of a Christopher Nolan movie. And the pressure's on. You know, this isn't some independent film that he did a good job in. You know, this is a blockbuster film.
Yeah, I think will be a good first look at him before the Batman comes out in 2021. That also has been delayed, of course. And with Tenet, you know, the longer it's delayed, I think the more of these like fan theories are going to keep swirling around.
We won't bore you with any fan theories about why exactly Tenet will turn out to be a sequel to Inception. But I personally haven't ruled out the possibility that the two movies, Inception and Tenet, will be connected. Every studio right now is trying to create a whole cinematic universe. And I feel like, you know, Nolan could give it a shot, and this might be his attempt to create a cinematic universe.
Yeah, I mean, he did a trilogy, so I don't think it's completely impossible. But, you know, Nolan has said he wants all of his movies to share like a similar DNA, but he also wants them to be distinct. So I doubt he would make like a low-key sequel to Inception. He fancies himself like an auteur. So even though he mostly sticks to the same genre for all of his movies, the heady, cerebral thrillers, he doesn't want to be known for one film in particular over another. Also, to be honest, it's a little basic that every time a similar movie comes out, there's all this speculation on movie podcasts and YouTube channels about, are they connected? Is John Wick a prequel to The Matrix? Is Pulp Fiction really a sequel to Reservoir Dogs? No. There are crossovers and references, but these directors want their films to stand on their own. So frankly, these kinds of discussions are really just a waste of our listeners' precious time.
Well, either way, I'm personally excited for Tenet. Even if it takes multiple viewings to understand. I know that South Park made fun of Inception for being complex for the sake of complexity, and that was funny, but that was before we had realized that if Christopher Nolan does something too straightforward, we get something as forgettable as Dunkirk.
Here we go again. We know you don't like Dunkirk, which is mystifying to me, honestly. Like, it made my list of top 10 films of the decade.
Oh, yeah, it is kind of that time. It's the year 2020. So that's on your top 10 of the decade? What are the other 9 movies on that list?
Well, since we don't really have many new movies to go over, we figured we'd do something a little different for this episode while we wait. It's 2020 now, so we have another decade of films in the can. So wouldn't it be fun to talk about our top 10 films of the decade? Now, there are a lot of reasons not to do this, right? We don't want our podcast to turn into Watch Mojo, where we just do lists and countdowns. But as the kids say, you only YOLO once. So, to start, at number 10, I have The Favorite. Now, this one I put on the list because it has beautiful cinematography. Even with the occasional disorienting fisheye sequences, I love those big wide shots. They have amazing production design, and it showed it off masterfully. Emma Stone was amazing, perfect tonally, and we see her character develop from a, downtrodden peasant, basically, to being able to play the political game. And, of course, Olivia Colman was great as the Queen. She won an Oscar, for goodness sakes. But this is a performance with zero vanity on Olivia Colman's part.
Mrs. Morley, we are at war.
We won!
Oh, it is not over. We must continue.
Oh, I did not know that.
She's able to do both kind of grotesque and weak, but yet powerful at the same time. Just a very interesting performance overall. The reason I didn't rank The Favorite or The Favorite higher is, although it's a good story, I didn't really feel for any of the characters other than Emma Stone's. She's our hero. We root for her and kind of despise the rest. Also, as I mentioned, kind of the fisheye sequences took me out of it.
I don't want to get political on this podcast at all, but and I respect, it's your top 10 list, but just the fact that The Favorite is spelled the British way with the OU, that triggers me. I haven't seen The Favorite. Sure, it's great, but I'm just triggered by the spelling of the name.
Yeah, I don't think spelling differences between countries is political, so don't worry about that. So, Zach, what did you have at number 10?
For me, number 10 at the top of the list, we have a new trendy director's latest movie. His name is Jordan Peele, and we're talking about the movie Us here. No, it is not in my top 10 solely for the soundtrack. The dun-dun. That's not the only reason I have it. I liked it so much. But Us, yeah, if you haven't seen it, I would describe it as solving a Rubik's Cube while walking through a haunted house. There's great characters in it. It's got kind of the typical family of a horror movie. And the dad has one of the best lines of the decade. If you've seen it, I'm talking about. If you want to get crazy, we can get crazy. There's, Jordan Peele's other movie, Get Out, was solid too, but I like this one better. And I think, after Get Out and Us, it's official that Jordan Peele knows what he's doing. And I'm looking forward to his next 8 movies or so. Like, he's kind of locked in as a good director in my book.
I'm surprised to hear that. I liked Get Out a lot more than Us. I thought it was a better movie. And I thought Us just, it came out too soon after Get Out. I think it was rushed a little bit.
I sort of saw it as like a different perspective. I saw it as, Jordan Peele, he had Key and Peele the show, and then him and the guy from Key and Peele, they made Keanu, the comedy about the cat. And then, the pressure was on, and then he had to make a relevant movie, and he made Get Out. And then the pressure was off, and then he's like, I have some credibility, so I'm just going to do what I want. And I feel like with Us, we got to see that.
Fair enough. For number 9, I had, believe it or not, Avengers Infinity War.
Fun isn't something one considers when balancing the universe. But this, it does put a smile on my face.
And the reason is because Avengers Infinity War is the blockbuster formula perfected. The spectacle is a wonder to behold. Of course, it's very broad, appealing to kids, adults, cinema lovers, cinema haters, but that's what that genre is all about. And it's a great example of how to make a movie with a massive ensemble cast. Something like Game of Thrones has a huge cast, but they have multiple episodes to tell that story. But Infinity War was able to squeeze all of that in one film, which is crazy. It was hilarious at times, and it doesn't overdo it on the jokes, and I thought also the emotional moments are impactful but not too dark, and they did a good job balancing those two tones. It is the culmination of 20 other movies before it, which is no easy task. And I think, as I mentioned before in a previous podcast, it has perfect pacing. It ticks along nicely the entire time, and you're never bored. You're always engaged and having fun. Also, the thing I think I like the most about it was brave enough to end with the villain winning, which never happens in these movies. It had a follow-up kind of part 2 movie, but if we consider Infinity War as its own movie, I think it was extremely successful at what it set out to do.
Okay, so you have Infinity War as number 9 on your list. I had Infinity War in a top 10 list of mine, but that was my top 10 amusement parks list of the decade.
Right.
Just kidding. No, for real. I approve of having this Marvel movie in a top 10 list. I think the best decision Marvel and Kevin Feige, who's in charge of Marvel, the best decision they ever made was giving the keys to these final Avenger movies to the Russo brothers. The Russo brothers don't mess around. They know what they're doing. For my number 9 movie, we have an Alex Garland movie. We're talking about Ex Machina. I feel like Ex Machina, it was the perfect movie to sort of talk about and bring up the idea of artificial intelligence. I know that's not a new idea, but I do think that the conversation about AI has evolved in the last 5 to 10 years. And I honestly think that Ex Machina was, a piece of that, increasing the discussion about AI. Everything about it's beautiful. The place where Oscar Isaac lives, his house, the labs, everything. I would say that this was the role where Oscar Isaac became a name. He wouldn't have got the Star Wars role without Ex Machina, and I feel like he just owned the state. He has a great presence in this movie. Sure, maybe Inside Llewyn Davis, he did a great job too, but this is my favorite Oscar Isaac role, and just the whole futuristic vibes and the mind games it plays earned a spot for it on my top 10 of the decade list.
And we've talked about this movie on the podcast before. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I did say jokingly that it's one long movie about the Turing test. I don't think that's fair. It was enjoyable, but definitely would not have made my top 10 list. So for number 8, I have Uncut Gems. I love the frantic pace. It's never boring in the slightest bit. The great characters. Sandler's kind of an everyman, but with a crucial flaw. We see the rush that he gets from his gambling addiction. He has many different kind of off-ramps to get out of trouble throughout the movie, but just can't help himself. I love it. Also, the setting was done perfectly. It's so clearly the New York Diamond District, not just because of the scenery, but because of the people and the performances that they give. I thought it had a satisfying and shocking ending that the film built towards through the entire runtime. And it's just kind of full of symbolism. We've talked about in a previous episode, every character is an uncut gem.
Yeah, I definitely approve of this being on a top 10 list. And when we talked about it on the podcast, I had seen it once and I liked it the first time, but I've gone back and I've watched it 2 more times and it just gets better every time. So that's a good choice, I'd say, for your number 8 movie. My number 8 movie of the decade, you guys probably forgot about this one, Cabin in the Woods. At one glance, you could say this movie is just stereotypical, everything's silly. We've kind of, we've seen the monsters in it before. It's just a bunch of young, good-looking people kind of being kind of stupid and getting themselves killed. But this movie takes that concept and kind of like turns it upside down and uses it. And for me, I thought like the characters, everybody was funny. Even, I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't seen it, but just everybody involved at the different layers of this movie was great. The kind of twist thing they have going was awesome. And I also think that Cabin in the Woods, there's one scene where it kind of zooms out on these 2 characters, kind of they're close to a monster, and then it zooms out and then you can see like a bunch of different monsters and you kind of learn how the whole situation is working. I think that was like one of the best shots of the decade. Yes, it was silly, but it was also just incredibly fun. And I rewatched it recently, and it holds up. And I'm shocked it's not on your top 10 list.
Really? I'm shocked it is on yours, to be honest. I do like how it parodied some of the like horror movie cliches and stuff. And like you said, it kind of was a different take on that concept. But top 10 of the decade?
Yes.
I don't think so. All right, so for number 7, I have Blade Runner 2049. And the main reason is because of Roger Deakins' cinematography is just so gorgeous here. Probably his best work he's ever done to date. Sometimes I'll just put this movie on with the sound off and just watch it to take in the visuals. I think it's great even without the music behind it. The fight with Harrison Ford I thought was incredible. It's visually stunning, action-packed, and yet just so cinematic. It's not like a bunch of really tight close-ups with action going on. I hate that stuff. The scene with his digital girlfriend and a gal he meets on the street kind of combining to become one person, I love it. It's cinematic, futuristic, and yet kind of weirdly unsettling all at the same time. It's one of those rare sequels that outshines its predecessor in every way. I like Blade Runner, but I love Blade Runner 2049. The reason I don't have it higher on this list is most of the film is misleading the audience, so it's not as effective story-wise on the second watch or third. Also, the middle of the film sags a bit, and I don't really like Jared Leto's performance.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on Jared Leto's performance on that one, and sometimes I think Jared Leto should just like skip a role that he's offered sometimes. But yeah, definitely like a really cool looking movie, and it's a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, and I think he took those horns from his Christopher Nolan movies and kind of made them synthesize a little bit, and just took the deep horn to a whole new level. It was like and and so it was pretty vibey. My number 7 top 10 movies of the decade, we got to have Drive in there. So Drive is my number 7. I still put the Drive soundtrack on repeat like probably 4 times a year. Amazing soundtrack. Every character was good, from Oscar Isaac's minor role to the mafia people in the movie. Everything was kind of fun but dead serious at the same time. I would say that Drive took Ryan Gosling. It took him from being a pretty boy, from The Notebook and kind of Remember the Titans, pretty boy characters. And then he just sort of became a bad dude and got a lot more intense roles, including from your list, Blade Runner 2049. I think he's a big reason why that movie's good. And Drive was definitely the launching pad for that direction in his career.
It was a good performance from him. The reason it's not on my list is it's a little slow, in my opinion. It takes it's kind of a slow burn. I do like it though, but yeah, I don't mind it being on a top 10. It's a lot of people's favorites who I know. For my number 6 favorite movie of the decade, I have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We did basically an entire episode on this movie, but just to recap, it takes place in Hollywood. It's about making movies, and it's great just as a period piece about the era. There's that great friendship dynamic between Brad Pitt and Leo. I also love like bending history too. That's really cool. It's a Quentin Tarantino movie, and I have always loved Tarantino. I loved this movie, and I thought it was kind of a culmination of all of his work. The reason why it's not higher is some parts were a little lame, like the depiction of Bruce Lee and the unnecessary backstory where Brad Pitt kills his wife for no reason. And as we talked about in our episode about this, I think the Margot Robbie scenes could have tied a little bit more into the narrative instead of being an unnecessary, B, C, or even D plot.
I liked Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but the fact that it's in your top 10 is the first of these movies that has made me cringe a little bit. For me, it was kind of like Quentin Tarantino being like, "Hey, I'm friends with Brad Pitt and Leo. Like these are my friends. Let's just make a movie together as friends and see what happens." That's what I felt was like the inspiration behind it. And I love Quentin Tarantino, and it's your list, but it just didn't totally do it for me. Let's move on to my number 6 movie of the decade. Also a Quentin Tarantino movie. But I would call this Quentin Tarantino's last great movie. We're talking about Django Unchained. The D is silent. First of all, the dentist was amazing. He played it's the same actor who played the Jew hunter. Jamie Foxx was amazing in it. He just let it rip in this one. And he was great. I was on his side, and he freaked me out, but I was still following him and rooting for him.
I like the way you die, boy.
And then I think this is one of Samuel Jackson's scariest roles. He terrified me in this one. He works at the Candyland Ranch in the movie, and he's kind of they're on a plantation with slaves, and he's just a total sellout to the owner of the plantation, and it just makes me uncomfortable. Just the scenes he's in, it terrifies me. People complain about the random violence sort of slapped into Quentin Tarantino's movies, kind of like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But I feel like in Django Unchained, we needed that. It worked so well, and when things got crazy and bullets were flying everywhere and just nobody was safe and it got kind of gory, I feel like at that point in the movie was just what we needed, and it felt so good just to see people shooting at each other for 20 minutes.
Interesting. Okay. That's one of Tarantino's movies that I'm not as into. I mean, I do enjoy it, but it's not one that I go back and rewatch very often. I do agree that Samuel Jackson's character is fantastic. And Christoph Waltz does a really good job as the dentist. I feel like the reason why he was cast, though, is because he did such a good job in the movie right before this with Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino likes to reuse actors a lot, and I wonder if he just wrote that character with him in mind. It's very, very Christoph Waltz, the whole performance and everything. That being said, I don't mind this being on your top 10. I think it's a pretty good choice. I just wouldn't put it on mine and didn't.
Ooh.
All right, at number 5, I have Mad Max Fury Road. I thought that this movie had fantastic world building and direction. I actually found myself reading the ancillary comic books to get even more background on the world. It was just really cool, with the little mesa with water and that just what the world has become by the time this movie takes place. It's able to do so much with very little dialogue. It's a mostly visual experience, and luckily it looks gorgeous. This is the kind of movie that I watched it and I liked it, and I didn't see any reviews beforehand, and was actually shocked the critics liked it too, just because it it almost feels like a comic book movie in a way, and isn't their usual type of movie that they love. So I was very surprised that the critics were so hyped about this movie. Reason why it's not higher is the story's kind of thin. It basically boils down to they run away from the place with water, then they turn around and come back. Also, some of the performances are a bit over the top and cartoonish.
Okay, first of all, I liked Mad Max Fury Road. Pretty good. But I'm not one of those people, when you talk about Mad Max Fury Road, people are just like, oh, isn't it just brilliant to see good action, real action without special effects? On one hand, like, yeah, that is impressive. Looking at the movie and realizing that special effects aren't a big part of it is kind of amazing when you see what they do. But when I'm watching it, like, I don't really think about that. I'm just like, what do I see? Is it believable? Okay, it is. I'm not going to give it extra points for, doing it the hard way. It was a cool movie. Tom Hardy was great. But there was just one line in it that totally threw me off. There's this guy and he's driving, to certain death. And he's like, what a lovely day!
Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
And I was just like, that's a little bit too much for me. But yes, a solid movie, and I imagine it's in a lot of people's top 10 of the decade. For me, number 5, and I can already feel the hate, but it's a Christopher Nolan movie. It's called Interstellar. It's just tough to beat, a scene as epic as, Matthew McConaughey flying a spaceship into a black hole with like a synthy organ being played by Hans Zimmer, him just like flying. It's tough to beat those scenes. I always love movies that make things that aren't cool. I feel like this kind of made science cool again. You could say that Interstellar made science great again. Yeah, just the stuff about physics, and you can tell that Christopher Nolan like really did his homework and had a lot of people like scientists with input on it. The effects were great. The stuff about time and relativity was fun, especially when there's a scene where they go down to a planet and then they come back, and because of relativity, like 20 years have passed. That kind of science stuff mixed into a story was awesome.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't also know why this movie gets so much hate. It's a good one, but like Django Unchained, it's one of the movies in Nolan's filmography that I don't really go back and rewatch much. I mean, I liked the Matt Damon stuff. I thought was really good. Like you said, the relativity, the robot was cool, but I don't know. I think the reason is because it's the story where he's like actually the one influencing events towards the beginning. Spoilers. Hopefully you've seen it by now. I don't know. That was kind of like, I don't know. I mean, do black holes really care about our personal lives that much?
Yeah, I think some of the criticism is valid. Like the bookshelf criticism. Like, yeah, that's kind of stupid. But my whole point is that the movie, I liked it enough that it like those things didn't bother me.
All right. For my number 4, I actually have a second Denis Villeneuve movie, if that's how you pronounce it, and that is Sicario. It has the best and most intense action sequence of any of these movies, including Infinity War, and that's the highway scene at the border. It has great performances from Emily Blunt and Benicio del Toro. We really feel his pain and understand his motivations, despite being squeamish about his methods. He's a wonderful example of the strong and silent character who says so much with very little dialogue. And the ending sequence, which sets up what is basically a Mexican Batman, Benicio del Toro's character is just so cool. I love it. And that plus the gorgeous cinematography, again, from our boy, Roger Deakins. This is a movie that I show people who visit me who haven't seen it. I'm like, that is required viewing. Let's sit down and watch it right now because you have to see it. The only reason it's not higher is Josh Brolin's character is a bit cartoonish at times as the heartless DOD agent, And despite kind of the tentpole scenes that I mentioned, some of it drags a little bit.
I love Sicario. If we had honorable mentions, this would definitely be in my honorable mentions for the decade. And I totally agree with you. The highway scene is probably the best scene of the decade. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it, and then you'll know what we're talking about. And then you got to appreciate that it had the Chandler, Arizona shout out. Sure, it didn't make Chandler, Arizona look great, but yeah, it got a little Arizona shout out. And then the last thing with the cinematography, I feel like before I saw Sicario, like I wasn't really thinking about cinema, like what good cinematography is. I'm like, isn't there just somebody like pushing play on a camera and making a shot? If you kind of segmented my movie watching career, right when I saw Sicario is when I started paying attention to cinematography. I'm like, oh wow, like that's okay. I get why there's a separate person doing this part of the movie. For my number 4 movie of the decade, I sense some hate coming too on this one, but I'm going to say Snowpiercer. You know, there's few things I like more in movies than just like a random sci-fi, and I felt like I didn't really know much going into it. And Snowpiercer is about a post-apocalyptic era where Earth has like tried to fix global warming, and in their efforts they just made the whole planet uninhabitable except for a train that's racing around the world on a track. And then we get into what it's like on that train, and it's Snowpiercer's by the guy who did Parasite. You know, he's all about his political themes. They're very obvious, and they're also very obvious in Snowpiercer about classism and, you know, moving different places in class and society, and that's all kind of a metaphor in this train. And basically you're following people trying to kind of overtake the current ruling system of the train, and then you go through this train, and it's just an adventure. Like each boxcar of this train feels like a whole different world, and you know, you kind of start out and it's just like a dirty train, and then you move on and you're just like wowed by each environment they go into. So yeah, Snowpiercer was just kind of I don't want to say perfect, but it was almost like an ideal sci-fi adventure for me.
I thought Snowpiercer was really good. I don't expect a ton of hate for that one. In fact, I know a lot of people who have that as their favorite movie of all time. So I think it's perfectly fair on a top 10 movies of the decade list. For number 3, I had The Vavitch, or also known as The Witch. And the reason I have it on my list is it's atmospheric despite being extremely low budget. The whole thing is just creepy and unsettling. There's lots of world building. I mean, the director clearly researched kind of the occult and the world of witches and symbology and things like that. It has beautiful cinematography. Again, despite the very narrow setting, it kind of takes place mostly at a cottage in the woods, but it looks really good. There are no jump scares. You know, it's really an art film that just so happens to be in the horror genre. And I don't even think it really becomes a horror in a true sense until the end. There are great characters, and the performances from Anya Taylor-Joy and Ralph Ineson especially. He plays the dad, and he has one of the best voices in the business. It's just so powerful and cinematic.
I cannot be judged by false Christians, for I have done nothing save preach Christ's true gospel.
The only reason this isn't higher is, like I said, the narrow scope. I mean, it focuses on a single family who are isolated in the wilderness. I think with a larger budget, it maybe could have shown a little more in the Puritan settlement that they leave at the beginning, and instead they had to just hint at a lot of that, and it mostly works, but I think it could have been just a tad better.
Yeah, this is another movie that I'll accept. It definitely wouldn't be in my top 10. For me, if you kind of if you split the movie in half, you have the whole witch supernatural aspect of it, and then the other half is kind of this Puritan family trying to survive in the new land. You know, this is back, you know, when America was just being discovered and people were settling there. And so I really like the settlement family version of it, but the whole supernatural side just didn't really do it for me. But I will say that it was good enough that, when we're talking about horror movies as a genre kind of having a renaissance in Hollywood lately, I think this is one of the movies you can point to, made by Robert Eggers. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of good horror movies coming out, and I think you can point to this one as one of those. So for my number 3 movie of the decade, you mentioned that The Witch was an art film. I'm going to get a little bit pretentious, and I'm going to say The Great Beauty. It's an Italian movie, foreign language film. And it first kind of appears like it's going to be pretentious, but it's one of those movies that plays a little game with you. It always, not for every scene, but it starts out a lot of scenes right in the middle of the action, but so much so that like something bizarre is happening. You're just like, what in the world is that? And then the camera zooms out or some time passes and you figure out exactly what's going on. So it was kind of just like, it was just like a fun little game like for each scene. And then also, I think it kind of captures, like, when you think of Europe and you think of, pretentiousness and style, everybody talks about Italy as being like the style capital of the world and stuff. I'm not really into that, but for this movie, I definitely was. You follow a writer, a guy who had written a book that got popular, and then so you get to follow his life, through his like friend group, his crowd of people. And, I love seeing movies about foreign countries and learning about them. And I feel like The Great Beauty, after seeing that, I had gotten a real feel for the glitzy side of European life.
Nice. I think this was the first movie that I reviewed on the podcast. And if I remember correctly, I think I gave it an 8 out of 10. I remembered I enjoyed it quite a bit. Like you said, it was beautiful to look at. My one criticism of it was that the main character living a superficial life and then, learning that life is about more than just partying and you need to be a good person is a little bit overdone. But I did enjoy it. All right, so for my number 2, I have Zach's favorite, Dunkirk, directed by Christopher Nolan. Reason being, it has the best aerial battle sequences ever put to celluloid. Up until this point, most of the time those kinds of shots were done with models or CG, but Christopher Nolan, being who he is, actually, strapped a camera on the side of an airplane and put his actors up there, and we get real shots of aerial battles over the ocean. It's visually stunning. There's a video on YouTube showing it as if it were a silent film, and it works perfectly because there's so much visual storytelling going on in the movie. The sound design and music is fantastic. You gave a shout out to Hans Zimmer earlier. I think he deserves one for this movie as well. The whole thing, it's based around like a ticking clock because the idea is we need to get as many people off this beach as possible. And it just works. I love the soundtrack, and the sound design, especially in the aerial battles, is just amazing. Also, we kind of mentioned this before in another podcast too, but the depiction of the enemy is great. It perfectly creates suspense. Alfred Hitchcock once said something like, if I explode a bomb on screen, I get about 3 minutes of the audience's interest. You see the bomb explode, you see the fallout, all that kind of stuff. But if I tell them, hey, a bomb is going to explode in 20 minutes, I get 20 minutes of interest and 20 minutes of suspense. And I think that applies to Dunkirk. We don't really see the enemy very much. You get a couple shots of their aircraft, you get a little bit of a blurry shot at the end of them, but they are this unseen force that's kind of always present and always threatening. Only reason it's not number one is the lack of character. We don't really get to know any of the characters of the movie. And I thought the Cillian Murphy sequences with him on the boat, showing PTSD and stuff, were a little thin and maybe even underexplored.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't want to give anyone the impression that I disliked Dunkirk. Like, I liked it a lot. But yeah, for me, kind of what you said about the characters, it just all felt a little bit lifeless to me, I feel like the most character development we got was just stoicism from the British people, and which is great and probably accurate. It's an amazing story in real life, but also a little lifeless to me. And maybe this is just a personal nitpick, but I didn't like the fact that we never got one big shot showing everything going on. We saw the smoke coming from Dunkirk across the ocean, but I feel like the most people we saw at the beach at one time was like 500 maximum. If you know your history, and they even say it in the movie, like there were 400,000 soldiers trying to cross the English Channel to get to Britain and away from the Nazis. And I feel like if I were to say this to somebody, they'd be like, hey, it's a Christopher Nolan movie. He's not going to use a bunch of special effects. But it's like, it feels like a little bit of a cop-out to me. It's like, oh, well, our movie wasn't good because we didn't want to use special effects. I don't know. I just feel like there was a good chance to add a lot of scope to it by showing the whole situation. But, you, Cody, you always complain about narrow shots. And I just feel like we got a bunch of narrow slivers of the situation. And I just wanted something bigger. All right, so for my number 2 movie of the decade, we're talking about the Safdie brothers' Good Time. Same people who made Uncut Gems. Everybody has their type of movie. Cody, you like any movie based on filmmaking. If there's a character with a camera, you just love it, no questions asked. My mom, for example, any movie where people are trapped on Mount Everest and getting frostbite, she just can't control herself. Those are her favorite movies. Me, I like it when people in the movie screw their lives up, and that's exactly what Good Time was. I was just like, wow, this is horrible. Don't do that. Okay, you did that. Okay, you're trying to fix the situation. Wow, it just got worse. Wow, this is horrible. It's like, how is this person even going still? Of course I like movies that are gritty and grimy, and this just encompasses that. But at the same time, it is kind of an interesting story to follow. And I think it's what, gave the Safdie brothers, their chance to have a big movie stars in their next movie, Uncut Gems. I think Adam Sandler said he saw that and he's like, I want to work with these people. So I think Good Time is the movie we'll point at. I think the Safdie brothers are going to be great directors, and maybe even like the Coen brothers category. And I think Good Time is like I know it's not their first movie, but I think this is the first movie where they showed that. So that's my number 2. And now we're going to our number 1 movies of the decade. Fasten your seatbelts. Cody, let's hear your number 1 movie of the decade.
So my number 1 movie of the decade is also my favorite film of all time right now. So of course it has to be number 1 on the list. And that is Jordan Peele's Get Out. It is teeming with symbolism. It's funny. It's political. It has amazing themes. And yet it's still cinematic. It has beautiful cinematography, awesome characters, all of whom we care about, we are interested in. The story is so good. I mean, it's unique. It's almost like an episode of The Twilight Zone, but even more kind of epic in its scale. The pacing is great. It's never boring. It's extremely rewatchable. Every time you see it, you get a little bit more out of it. You notice something that you didn't notice before, and that's still happening. And I've seen it probably a dozen times. It has world building like crazy and a whole huge backstory that's only hinted at. And Jordan Peele expands on this a little bit in some interviews and things like that. So if you love this movie, go check those out because it's interesting to hear about some of this stuff, that Knights Templar and stuff. It's pretty crazy. And it's an original concept. We complain about movies not being unique anymore and everything's a remake and blah, blah, blah. But this one it's totally original. It's a great, great, great movie. I would say it is the perfect film. So that's my number one, Jordan Peele's Get Out.
Okay, wow. And especially wow, you saying it's your favorite movie of all time. I thought Get Out was good. Just a little bit too on the nose for me. But I've only seen it one time, and I'm not familiar. You were talking about like Knights Templar stuff. That I didn't know that. Maybe I should go back and watch it again. But all right, I guess that's your number one. My number one movie of the decade, Hereditary, the horror movie by Ari Aster. I don't know why, but like 15 years ago, I stopped getting really scared by movies. I just didn't get scared by them anymore. I wasn't checking behind my shower curtain, after seeing scary movies. I don't know what happened. Maybe I just didn't get scared because that time in my life, the terror of actually talking to a girl completely eclipsed every type of fear I've had. But seriously, though, Hereditary is the last time I can remember being like terrified, like physically, in a movie, and I wasn't sure if I would make it through. I'm not the biggest horror fan, although there's a lot of good movies coming out, so that's becoming, a genre I like more and more. But the reason Hereditary is my number one is I feel like if you like hook sensors up to me while I'm watching a movie and just like measured the chemical reactions in my body, like as an effect of watching the movies, like a lot of these movies would be high on that scale of measurements, but like Hereditary, if you were to like measure my reaction, like everything would just go off the charts. Like it was a painful movie. It's tough to get through, but the last 15 minutes of it were just like shocking, like unbelievably scary to me, and those like 15 minutes alone probably make it the best movie of the decade for me. Amazing cinematography. I didn't think Midsommar, Ari Aster's next movie, was as good as Hereditary, but yeah, Hereditary is my number one of the decade.
I liked Hereditary a lot too. Especially, some of the dollhouse stuff. It had great cinematography, had great tension and things like that. My complaint with it was that you mentioned those last 10 minutes. That's like the big reveal, and the rest of the movie is just like leading you on. It's kind of like, what's going on here? Why did that happen? And you're kind of confused throughout the whole thing, and it kind of made me lose interest a little bit partway through. I do wish that sequence at the end had been like maybe the last 30 minutes of the movie, but fair enough. It's a great movie. Ari Aster is a very, very talented director, and I'm looking forward to what else he puts out. So those are our lists. Let us know what you thought. And of course, stay tuned for 2030 when we'll reveal our top 10 films of the 2020s.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's get into our recommendations part of the show. So each episode, I recommend a movie for Cody to watch, and he recommends a movie for me to watch. And then we go and watch them, and then we talk about our thoughts on the next episode. This is kind of an interesting part of the show because I'll see a movie and I'll be like, hey, I really enjoyed that. Maybe Cody would like it. We appreciate movies differently, so let's see what Cody thinks. And that's how I go into a recommendation. And then Cody's recommendations are always some type of statement, some type of test or way to discredit me. And I'm not really sure what his goal is, but let's get into our recommendations.
You're so paranoid, Zach. No, I mean, the movies that I recommend to you are movies that I want you to watch. Not because I necessarily think that you'll like them, but because I'm curious about your take on them. So that kind of explains a little bit of my motivations, hopefully. Not that you'll believe it. But go ahead with the movie that you recommended for me to watch.
Okay, last week I mentioned that a listener had recommended Tampopo to me. Then I watched it, and then I just kind of had 2 hours straight of my mind being blown. It's your typical Japanese food Western movie. It's just a typical one. I know that sounds weird, and yes, it is a weird movie, but it's amazing. The story kind of goes off in weird directions, but it's essentially about a guy helping a lady turn her struggling ramen restaurant into a success. Cody, what did you think of Tampopo?
I really liked Tampopo. It was like a whimsical movie. It was fun to watch. I was entertained the entire time. Let's start with what I liked. This is a great movie about the difference between amateurs and professionals and kind of the journey from amateur to professional. And we see how, towards the beginning and the middle, how the main character Tampopo makes many, classic amateur mistakes. For example, there's a sequence where she tries to steal the recipe for some really good ramen from a competitor. And then she tries to make it herself from that recipe, and it's just a disaster. Which goes to show, like, just knowing the recipe is not enough to master something. You need to put the time and the work in to get there. And this movie definitely shows her entire process of becoming, a master at making ramen. I also like that the film follows the hero's journey pretty closely. I'm a sucker for those types of stories. She meets her mentor at the beginning, who dresses a bit like a cowboy. He even rescues her from some bad customers in a very Obi-Wan rescuing Luke from Sand People-like moment. And then he kind of guides her along this journey of making the perfect bowl of ramen. And she picks up allies along the way as well as enemies. And it even ends in a huge celebration. I liked all that. And I was super entertained through it. What I didn't like, it was occasionally punctuated with these short vignettes. I've heard them described as side dishes to the main narrative, which is kind of the main course. These didn't really work for me. I'm sure people who love this movie to death love those sequences, but they didn't really tie in. Maybe I'm missing some deeper narrative that ties them all together and, other than that they're all about food. But I don't know. Most of them were just kind of silly. There was one in particular where a bunch of random characters who we've never met before, which is how all those vignettes are, they're in a business meeting, and out of deference to one another, they all order a very modest meal. They all order the same thing. But a younger man just goes to town on the menu, ordering everything he wants. And it was interesting. It was, I guess, kind of entertaining, but because it's seen as disrespectful or rude or something. But part of what I didn't like about this movie is when it got really just cheesy. All of their faces at the table turned literally bright red. It was just kind of silly. I don't know. I'm not as into the campy stuff, but overall, I did really like Tampopo. If you cut the vignettes, I think it would be in 9 territory, as it's a really sweet story about perseverance and putting in the work to truly master something. Also, as I mentioned, it's an interesting take on the hero's journey. So I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty good. An 8 out of 10 for one of my recommendations. This Tampopo's on the it's in the Criterion collection, so it's pretentious. So maybe that's why you liked it. Just one comment on your review about the side vignettes. Yeah, there's this one scene where you're looking at our main characters in the street, and then those businessmen you were talking about, they're just in the side of the shot, and then they're just walking by our main characters, and you kind of notice them, and you're like, huh, weird. And then the camera just follows them, like the director had ADD and just changed his mind on what's going on. And I love those little bits of it, and yeah, just the weird randomness of it was just that's what I liked most about it.
And then I recommended to you to watch the 1949 war film 12 O'Clock High, starring Gregory Peck. And I recommended this to you because it's one of the first classic movies that I watched. You know, besides obviously like Wizard of Oz or whatever. But you can blame this movie for me loving those types of movies and constantly recommending them to you. Because when I saw this, I was like, wow, that was really good. I wonder how many other of the hundreds and hundreds of movies from that era that I haven't seen are this good. So, well, Zach, I mean, usually you don't love those kinds of movies. So, what did you think of 12 O'Clock High?
First of all, I saw the 1949 release date and I was thinking I was just in for another Cody movie, just a classic, in quotes, movie that hasn't aged well and you can only appreciate if you're into movies from when cars still didn't have seatbelts. But I was still optimistic, though. The fact that it's a World War II movie gave me hope. And not to mention Paths of Glory, also a war movie from the 1950s, is one of my favorites. So I'm like, maybe it'll be good like Paths of Glory. All right, so let's start off with what I liked about 12 O'Clock High. At the beginning, there's text on the screen, and it says, all the fighter plane footage is real recorded video from World War II. And I was like, okay. A few minutes later into the movie, you hear a brutal war story from a character, and you're like, geez, you're just back in that like war, that horrific war mindset. And I gotta admit, like, I was kind of sold by this point. Sure, you can get a great director like Spielberg to perfectly replicate D-Day, like in Saving Private Ryan. Or you can have a movie like Dunkirk, uses fancy cameras and sound equipment to make you feel like you're there in the action. But I feel like this being so close to World War II, it came out like less than 10 years after World War II ended. Like, I felt like it was so fresh on the minds of the filmmakers and the audience at the time. I kind of felt like I was getting inside information on what it was actually like to fight in World War II. So in 12 O'Clock High, you're immediately thrown into an aerial bombing brigade and their mission. And everybody's speaking in military terms. I have no clue if what they're saying is accurate, but it doesn't seem to dumb down the situation at all. For example, the air squadron is this team of people flying planes. They're ordered to fly at 9,000 feet instead of 19,000 feet, and then everybody in the brigade just thinks it's a mistake because 9,000 feet would be so much more dangerous when you're bombing someone. And it doesn't waste your time like spelling it out exactly why that's bad, but you just sort of figure out the situation just by their reactions and as they continue to talk about what's going on. And speaking of getting orders, I love when movies show and introduce you to bigger and bigger bosses. We start out with the lead of the squadron. He's a colonel, and his men are completely loyal to him. He gets mad about this order, and you're mad with him, and you think, whoever's sending these orders is ignorant and off his rocker. He's sending these kids into war in dangerous circumstances. So this colonel, he goes and meets with the general who gave him the orders, and you learn that the general not only understands what he's doing, but he's also looking at the situation from a lot of different perspectives. We have that general, and you're like, okay, he knows what's going on. If he gave that order, there's obviously a reason. And then we meet this general's boss, and he not only understands the significance of what they're doing, but he also understands all too well, like the psychological breakpoints of these soldiers, who do have boots on the ground, who are in the planes risking their lives. I was just like, man, like this is a tough and complex situation. There's this phrase that's repeated throughout the film, maximum effort.
Then put them back in and fly them some more. We've got to find out what a maximum effort is, how much a man can take and get it all.
It gets discussed a lot in the movie, but to me, it basically means a soldier giving it his all until they either die or go crazy. It's horrible to force that upon people, but at the same point, like, this is war, and at that time, the victory of the Nazis was still a possibility, so you're just like, this is horrible, but I get why these soldiers have to do this. Another element of 12 O'Clock High that I liked was the bar rescue vibe. You know, if you've seen Bar Rescue, it's a reality show about a big, loud New Yorker guy who comes into people's restaurants and he just lays the hammer down to straighten them out. You know, he'll roast employees who are just skating by. You know, he, in the restaurants, like, if he sees anything unsanitary, like a table, like, it's not clean, he'll just erupt with anger. He'll call out the manager of the restaurant in front of the entire staff. In 12 O'Clock High, the general does a similar thing with the squadron. He replaces the colonel we mentioned earlier. He replaces him with himself. And he comes into this brigade and just straightens out the soldiers. But unlike Bar Rescue, the problem isn't people taking extra long lunch breaks. You know, the soldiers are riddled with fear, and many are facing like horrific PTSD. You know, among the personnel changes that he makes, you know, he puts new rules in place for this squadron of pilots and bombers. But at one point he says, consider yourselves already dead. Once you accept that idea, it won't be so tough. And that line, like, kind of stuck with me. And I think I learned something about management from watching Gregory Peck, the star of 12 O'Clock High, who's also your boy, Cody, Gregory Peck.
Oh, yeah.
And getting, you know, I learned something about management by the way that, you know, he dealt with everything and, you know, got his soldiers ready to fight Nazis. What I disliked is one thing that war movies do, and this one also does. You know, when soldiers are on a mission or something, you usually have an idea of their goal, but the action is just a bunch of random shots and events on the way to that goal. And in 12 O'Clock High, you know, they just sort of give you, with the aerial battles, they sort of give you bits and pieces of the action and what's going on. You know, they're trying to bomb somebody. And then they're like, okay, we crossed the border of France to Germany. And then the planes are shooting at each other, and then it's over. And you're kind of left in the dark to what was happening besides, you know, a little bit of info here and there. You know, it's kind of disorienting, and you don't really know exactly what to pay attention to and what's important. Another very minor thing that bothered me about 12 O'Clock High is, this is very minor, but they showed these huge maps on the walls when they're planning for battle and planning the route of the ships bombing. And, you know, if you're going to go through the trouble of making a map, making a set with a huge map in it, at least make it a little easier to read. You know, I love looking at maps, and I was just like, I can't even read that map. So I wish they would have tried a little harder with the map piece of the set. Overall, though, I gotta admit, 12 O'Clock High was a great movie, and I give it an 8 out of 10.
Awesome. Well, I'm super glad you enjoyed it. Hopefully that opens the door for you to enjoy other classic films. What I loved about 12 O'Clock High is it's the perfect example of character development. I mean, it's just done so well. The main character, played by Gregory Peck, goes from having one position, which is, you know, being very tough, very management. I actually hadn't thought of the bar rescue thing until you mentioned it, but it's kind of true. It's like a Gordon Ramsay type situation. Which, again, this is why I want your take on these things, Zach. But that's what I love about it, is just it's a great example of a character going from A to B, and it does it super well. It did remind me a lot of Paths of Glory in terms of just the vibe of it. But Paths of Glory, I feel like, didn't have as much of that character development. All the characters kind of stay who they are throughout. So I love this movie. I'm glad that you loved it too. For the next episode, I can't wait for you now to watch Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, the 1958 film Vertigo. Now, don't worry, this one is in full color. It's beautiful color, actually. So no more black and white for now. I'm not going to say much about it. It's best to go in completely blind. Don't read about it. Don't watch any trailers. Don't talk to anybody about it. And to our listeners, we are going to discuss this in the next podcast. So I highly recommend that you watch it if you haven't seen it too. We'll probably give a disclaimer in the next episode too. Number one, for your own entertainment. I mean, it's a 10 out of 10 film, according to me. And two, because once you hear us talk about it, you'll no longer be able to get that experience of going in knowing absolutely nothing.
I kind of, of course, I naturally wince when, you tell me a movie that I'm going to watch is from 1958, but I've never really sat down and gone through Hitchcock movies. You only hear awesome things about them. And maybe I saw The Birds when I was like 3 years old, but I haven't really watched any Hitchcock movies, so I am excited to see something he's done. All right, and so for my recommendation, this is one of those recommendations where I'm like, why haven't I recommended this before? And we're talking about Old Boy. It's definitely a movie you obviously don't want to know much about going into. And it's a Korean movie. Cody, Parasite is not the first and only Korean movie. There's other Korean movies out there. And I think Old Boy is probably the best. The Koreans pump out a lot of good movies, and this is probably my favorite out of them. So, Old Boy.
All right, well, I look forward to watching that. And to the folks at home, thanks so much for listening. We love the feedback. So leave comments, send us texts if you know us. Don't text us if you don't know us. And if you get a chance, check out the movies we talked about in this episode or the movies that we'll talk about in the next episode.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for listening. And then obviously subscribe and everything to make sure that you don't miss an episode. And make sure to tell your friends about this podcast. Don't hog all the great entertainment for yourself.